the cloud. So we just started the recording for anyone who missed us. This is a presentation that summarizes some of the efforts that the Office of Sustainability has been doing to sort of better understand climate justice impacts in the community. Thank you so much, Irina.
So there are three main indices: health, socioeconomic vulnerability, environmental justice. Those are the three main indices that we have developed. And on top of that, we're looking at climate impacts in the realms of heat and flooding. So taking a look at what went into these three indices, first one being health, we looked at what outcomes in terms of health would be affected by the environment and climate change. And here are the top 6 that we were able to get data on for the city of Newark by census tract. And they're based not only on the rationale that they could be influenced by the environment, but also these are common outcomes that are looked at in other very similar indices that have been used in other cities similar to Newark. For socioeconomic vulnerability, we have a couple more indicators, more data available, not as many privacy restrictions with data. So we have by census tract, race and ethnicity, households that qualify as low income, education, age, unemployment, health insurance status, renter status, folks with disabilities, no vehicle access, working outdoors, and linguistic isolation. All this data is from the American Community Survey and available publicly by census tract. And these are also important indicators of socioeconomic vulnerability as it relates to the environment and people's ability to respond to climate change and other related issues. And finally, we have an environmental justice index. And this also, we have data by census tract. And this includes different measures of air pollution, so fine particulate matter, traffic proximity and volume, air toxics, cancer risk, ground level ozone, diesel particulate matter. And then there's other dimensions here that we're looking at: distance to green space, limited access to healthy foods, proximity to hazardous sites, imperviousness, so that's the ability of water to drain into the ground, tree canopy cover, and a lead exposure risk index. And finally, we have the climate impacts that we're looking at in relation to these 3 indexes. And for one of them, we're looking at how much there is increased heat amplified by the urban heat island effect. So we looked at land surface temperature in July. And for those of you very familiar with the geography here, you can see right where the parks are. You can see where very high areas of concrete are. And then also increased flooding with sea level rise. This is based on the New Jersey Flood Mapper application, and it's based on expected flooding by 2050, and it's with a moderate climate emissions scenario. So if you were to guess everything was 50%, not the highest, not the best, not the worst, right in the middle, those are the scenarios that we went with. These are the areas that are expected to flood regularly. And so in order to build each of those 3 indexes, we went through this process. So we first decided on those indicators that we just went over and collected census tract level data for each. I'll get back to the weights in a second because that's an optional step that we decided to take, and then there was a spoiler there. But from this effort, we were able to generate z-scores, which basically ranks different census tracts relative to one another. So if you know the percentage of people suffering from asthma in a census tract, and you look at all the census tracts, you're basically ranking them according to each other with these z-scores. And then we summed all of the indicators within each index. So the asthma z-score plus the COPD one plus all the other ones. Next, we determined low, medium, and high priority census tracts for each index based on that overall sum. And finally, we were able to combine the three different indices in different ways to make maps to show the distribution of these kind of scores by census tract. So which ones come out high, medium, and low based on these three different dimensions and the climate indicators. And so one of these optional steps was to assign weights to more or less important indicators. So this is something we discussed at meetings with, was it about 20 different people, Natalie? And we just tried to discuss, were certain indicators more important than others for making each index? So is asthma much more important of an indicator than COPD? Is race a much more important indicator than low income? And so we got 16 people to respond to a survey about that, and we decided that the health indicators should be weighted equally. Some of the socioeconomic indicators were much more important than the others, and environmental should be weighted equally. But spoiler alert, when we applied the weighting, it didn't change any of the index values. Everything looked the same. We looked at the maps again. Every census tract had the same value that it already started with. So I think it was a good exercise to think through and everything, and it was good to see if that made a difference, and it actually didn't. So let's take a look at the maps. Here's the first one. Here's the health index. So you're looking at the relative priority of each census tract based on those 6 different health indicators. So if there's a dark purple, that means they're high priority, meaning they scored very high with a high level of people with those different health outcomes. So I'll let you take a minute to kind of absorb what's going on here. And I guess I can also pause for any questions at this point.
Right, it makes sense to just kind of keep going and then pause at the end for questions. If that sounds good to you, Nicole?
Yes, I started nodding, but I remembered I turned my screen off. Agreed.
Okay.
It's mostly for me to stop asking questions.
Yeah, and I can definitely share these slides. So if you didn't get to fully absorb, I know, like for me, I'm like, I go right to my census tract. I'm like, how is it doing? I go right there. So hopefully you got a chance to see where you are. And later you can take a deeper look. Next, we have the socioeconomic index. And if we flip back and forth between the two, you can see a lot of the same census tracts are lighting up over here. But now we have Ironbound jumping in. The same census tract is high priority when we look at the socioeconomic indicators. And then if we look at those two together, you can get a sense that basically those ones that we saw that were for each are kind of combining to get this overall picture. So if we're not considering any direct indicators of the environment and just what the underlying health outcomes and socioeconomic status is, this is how census tracts would be prioritized. Now looking at the environmental burden index, remember this is based on air pollution data, Superfund sites. This is how environmental burdens are distributed in Newark if we weight them all equally and rank them. So notice all of this is pretty much surrounding the industrial area, these high priority census tracts. And now here's a look at all 3 indexes combined. And to me, this looks very similar to when we just had the health and socioeconomic one, but a few extra census tracts are prioritized over here. Now when we take into account climate impacts, here is that combined, all 3 indices combined plus heat. So remember that map of land surface temperature, that is layered on top of here by census tract. And once again, very similar census tracts highlighted. But when we take a look at flooding, not so surprisingly, the census tracts that are closer to the river are getting a little bit more highlighted here. And that is the last map. So at this time I can take questions, and if somebody wants me to pull back up one of the maps, let me know.
Thanks so much, Irina. I was just preparing something to drop into the chat so that folks are aware of a sort of an existing available website to review some of this data, not compiled in an index form, but each individual data layer, almost all of them, Irina, I would say, are inside of the ERI website. So I'm going to drop that in the chat in just a minute. And there, just to kind of reiterate a big picture takeaway, why did we do this? I think when it comes to doing any kind of plan development work, you're often in a situation where you want to hear people's opinions about different programming or policy priorities, and knowing the folks that are most directly affected helps the Office of Sustainability sort of target resources and direct resources. So I will, as I said, kind of just show you where you can see the individual layers online right now. A conversation that came out of our last advisory group meeting was about making this data sort of more available more publicly. I've not had a chance to sort of shop this around internally. And to sort of let people know the work that I'm doing. I want to make sure that I have a chance to do that. And then eventually I would like to sort of have this live on that environmental resources inventory page, even though it wasn't a product of the environmental resources inventory. So I also have to kind of figure out where it's going to live and how we talk about these data layers, so that folks like you all who might be interested in showing some of these indices for your grant writing activities, for your programmatic priority activities, or what have you, have access to this information that, we've put a lot of brain power into. Let me just go back to Irina's flag, which is, does anyone have questions or want to learn a little bit more about this effort? Go ahead, Cynthia.
Yeah, it's more of a comment because I'm responsible for educating the Latino Action Network about environmental justice and why we should be supporting certain things. And folks have differing levels of grasp of what that is. These slides are gold. This is the kind of stuff that our community needs to see, to understand why we drill down in certain areas. So thank you, Irene, as usual, Elena, good stuff.
Yeah, and I also wanted to just mention, I like the two, I wish you had the flooding and the heat one sort of side by side so that you could sort of see the overlap. So much of this is really, it's not to target, it's not like pointing a finger at these census tracts. It's really sort of like seeing where the most vulnerable populations, those who are currently being affected and who are most likely to be affected by projections in the future. And so, all of Newark falls well below median levels for pretty much all of these indices, right? And so these are the most vulnerable in a vulnerable town, right? It's just almost staggering to look at the numbers when they're really broken down.
Yeah, that's a really crucial point. If we were to compare to the state level, everything might be a dark shade. But for these specific maps, these specific indices, it's comparing Newark census tracts against each other to provide a ranking just for prioritization within the city. And if you're interested in the specific values for your census tract, because if for you it's not important who's the priority, then the ERI is where to turn to get the specific data points for that.
And Liz asked if these had been compared to the EPA EJ screening tool. I know that Natalie had discussed some maps coming out that you were looking to do comparison with. So I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the community of practice around doing this kind of work, whether it is creating a composite of health outcomes or creating a composite of what's called social vulnerability, which a lot of people do in sort of an emergency management space. Like there's a lot of conversation about how many indicators to put into a composite index and how to show those. The EJ screen applies very specific sort of EPA available indices, but very relatively few, Irina, correct me if I'm wrong, of the health ones. And so EJ screen is specifically, I think there will be a lot of overlap in the data that we have for the one indicator that has to do with the environmental burden. And then some of the social vulnerability ones. So I don't think they have linguistic isolation. I don't think they have educational attainment. They have like your classic EJ scores, which have to do with race and income, right? The correlation that we all understand is often found that disadvantaged, disenfranchised communities are often where you have sort of toxic waste facilities cited and so on and so forth. So EJ screen just has a different purpose, a different end goal. But a lot of the same foundational information, we depended heavily on EPA data in order to be able to sort of do this mapping for ourselves. And then to Nicole's point about other like efforts that are happening in the state, New Jersey just passed an environmental justice law and is going through its rulemaking process. In doing so, they identified through their own sort of mapping what they are calling overburdened communities, OBCs. The overburdened communities are a composite primarily of some of the socioeconomic layers that we were showing earlier. So we want to sort of, I think that EJ, correct me if I'm wrong here, I think a lot of you are tracking that EJ bill a lot more closely than I am. I don't think that the way they defined an overburdened community pays any attention to the proximity to toxic sites or to the prevalence or to the air toxic risks or what have you. It's just the sort of indicators of community, like being disenfranchised or being overburdened or being distressed and so on and so forth, which then dictate where the DEP would be more intentional about their environmental permitting process. Is that correct?
I'm not certain about that. They're still developing it, but I know that the cumulative nature of it means that they are taking into account the other sort of, pollutants in a particular area, so that they, have a measure of what not to build upon. But again, that the rulemaking is still happening. We're still waiting, and that the bill was signed back in 2020, and so we'll keep an eye on that. We'll keep an eye. There's one point that I did want to make with regard to this map. This has not been done for an academic reason. This has been done so that we can sort of like relatively quickly pinpoint sites to be able to do focused action, to be able to make change. And so in an academic setting, there would be much more sort of like rigorous, academic stuff happening. We really took existing materials, existing indices, existing maps and layers that we, the team that has worked on the ERI, Natalie and her team, under the leadership of the Environmental Commission, to take existing resources and be able to use them in order to move to action. That's really what this is for. It was done relatively quickly on an academic kind of timescale, but it's really so that when we move the SAP into sort of like, how are we defining our priorities and what are we going to be doing? How are we assigning action points? What are we going to be actually doing over the next 5 years? We say, okay, these are the target areas that we want to be able to focus on.
Yeah, and if I could circle back for a second to the EJ screen comment, if you're interested in how your census tract compares to the state or the US level, that's what EJ screen is intended to do. They apply the same methodology across cities across the whole US. So if that's what you're interested in, that's what you should turn to. For these indices, once again, they're for census tract within Newark comparison. And yeah, it allowed us to tailor it to the specific Newark context.
So I don't know if there are any other questions. I did see that there were a couple folks that sort of joined while the presentation was going on, but I can kind of pivot a little bit to that sort of application if that's helpful, unless you want to do a quick intros or something, Nicole.
Well, we actually were 5 minutes over, and I don't want to, I know we still have John, we still have several other things to talk about, so I don't want to, I'm trying to find that doggone agenda. I don't want us to go too far from this. So We did record this session for anyone who did come on late, who wasn't able to catch everything. And Natalie and her team will be following up with sort of like, a breakdown of the indices, as well as a link to ERI database and some other tools as well. So we'll be able to share all of that for anyone who wasn't able to join. But if there's no other questions, then I think we should go ahead and move on. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a comment. As we speak, I got a text from Anabaptista because an EJ group in Chicago, Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, is looking to pass a similar law to Newark's ordinance, and they're looking for wisdom from us about how to make it better. So that's really, I'm really going to be thinking about that in the next few days, and hope others will help with that, because it's just oddly timely. Thanks. I mean, I can think of some stuff, and our high hopes is that the statewide law will help us make the city ordinance more actionable and better, but I haven't figured it out yet. I'm looking for advice. Thanks.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, yes, I didn't know if I put it back on mute. All right, so next I'm gonna have you turn your brains on. I need your brain power, okay? We're gonna go into breakout groups and do some brainstorming as you're, I don't know who, if you are not aware, I'm letting you know right now, we are claiming it. There is going to be a Newark Green Fair this spring. And to make that happen, we need, number one, some ideas and possibly some help. No, how about, we need definitely ideas and definitely help. And so to start with, let's get some, we're going to do some breakout groups, and we want to talk